Today we're looking at Gilded Age Politics, basically corruption and reform in the United States from the 1870s to the 1890s. Basically what we want to understand is, first of all, what is the Gilded Age? This was a time period of the 1870s to the 1890s, and it's a period that on the one hand is characterized by the growth of business. This business made people incredibly wealthy, so a good example of this would be the home of J.P. Morgan's sister on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Very, very plush house that she lived in. And keep in mind, during this time period, the wealthy industrialists, this was not uncommon to have a house like this in the country and then something closer to large cities like New York City. But it was also a time of lots of social problems. There were people that were not benefiting as much from industrialization. So a good example of this is in the top right-hand corner of the screen. This is a family of Italian immigrants to New York City, living in today what would be characterized as slums, where you could have an entire family living in what we would consider to be in a single efficiency apartment. So basically one room, little area to cook food with, and not much else. So a lot of money is being made, but at the same time, that wealth is not being distributed equally. This is causing social problems, and there are also problems with politics. So politics, as usual, in the Gilded Age consisted, first of all, of political machines. These are basically local political party organizations, so the Democrats and the Republicans had them. They were usually led by a local boss, and this boss and the people that worked underneath of him fit into the political structure, because basically what they would do is they would go out and they would buy votes for the political parties. They would control elections, and they made a lot of money doing this. So a good example of political bosses would be Boss Tweed of New York City, who is shown on the right-hand side of the screen. And this is a political cartoon that's making fun of attempts to reform politics. Here he's being arrested, and the guy that's arresting him is tipping his hat to him. They know each other, and everybody in that room knows that nothing is really going to happen to Boss Tweed. So at the local level, you had these political machines. At the state and the federal level, you had a system known as the spoils system. So at the federal level, for example, whoever won the presidential election would basically give government positions to their friends. And in this time period, you could make a lot of money off of your job in both state and federal governments. So you could take kickbacks, you can take payoffs, bribes, all sorts of different ways of making money in a real shady manner. But you could also make a lot of money if you, say, owned a business and you ran the government position that you were in a way that favored your business. So you had the political machines, you had the spoils system, and government also worked a lot differently than it does today. Today, the presidency is kind of considered to be the head of our federal government. Same thing with our state governors. Back then, the executive branch, that's the presidency that's responsible for running government. The executive branch was really weak. So presidents from this time period usually go unheard of among most Americans when it comes to history. So who was the power behind everything in this time period? Well, at the federal government, it was the legislative branch. That's Congress, which write laws and controls spending. And at the state level, it would be the state legislatures. Keep in mind, though, that these groups of individuals were no less a problem for everyday Americans than the political machines or the spoils system. So a good example is in the late 1800s, practically the entirety of the Nebraska state legislature was bought off by railroad companies who would give them tons of money to make sure that they didn't interfere with the company's, basically charging farmers an arm and a leg just to get these farmers' crops to market. So the farmers lost out, and the railroads and the legislatures, they made out really big in terms of getting wealthy. So there were a lot of demands for reform. One of the very first reform acts to get passed during the Gilded Age was the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. This was an attempt to get rid of the spoils system. Basically what it did is it made federal jobs based on merit or ability. So it didn't matter who your friends were. You basically had to go in, you had to take a test before you got a job, and that was to hopefully prevent high-ranking government officials from, doling out positions to friends and family members. Another important piece of legislation was the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. This created the Interstate Commerce Commission. And what it did is it regulated or put laws in place when it came to interstate trade and railroads. And this was meant to help really the farmers, who again were being charged these ridiculous amounts of money by railroad companies just to take their crops to a market where they could sell them and pay their bills. So if you were buying or selling or moving goods across state lines, you had to basically follow the rules that the Interstate Commerce Commission set for you. Finally, there was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. One of the big things of this time period was the creation of monopolies. This is basically the control of one section of the economy by one company. So imagine today if Apple was the one that made all the cell phones that were out there, and say T-Mobile was the only company that you could go and get a cell phone service from. Apple and T-Mobile, they would be able to charge whatever amount of money that they wanted to without any competition. So what this did is it went in there and said, okay, one company can't control an entire industry. If it does, we're going to break it up. And this was meant to promote competition in business, so that the customer, if they couldn't find a good price in one place, they could go and get a better price somewhere else. So when we look at the Gilded Age, keep in mind it's a time period where we're making a lot of money, but there's still a lot of problems. It starts off a lot of corruption, a lot of issues in the government, but by the close of the Gilded Age, we started to see a number of laws being put in place. These are all federal laws that we looked at, but it's at the federal and at the state legislature to get rid of some of those issues.